been a very eventful past week. So over the weekend, people may have followed. It's pretty hard to ignore, really, given how much media attention has been focused on Ukraine. Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance, they basically had a Oval Office committee meeting of sorts to talk about a ceasefire agreement, and it went for about 50 minutes. I don't know if anyone actually sat down to watch the whole thing, but I did for this talk, and it was fairly polite actually for the first 40 minutes, but the last 10 minutes the thing completely derailed, and basically what came out in the last 10 minutes was an open denigration by Trump and Vance of Zelensky, and this has sent shockwaves across the world. It was basically what they were meeting about, if people have followed, in the last few months. It's been a couple of months since Trump's been in power. Zelensky actually invited Trump into signing an agreement around a minerals deal, which was basically to set up a co-owned investment fund, which would basically, contain all the profits and money that comes from a minerals agreement, as part of a ceasefire plan with Russia. There was also, there was very, cheap shots made. People would have seen the things about Zelensky's suit and other things. But really at the heart of the debate, and where it went off the rails, was because Zelensky was making continual demands and making an argument for security guarantees as part of this ceasefire. And that has been a point of tension and open opposition by the Trump administration. Previously Zelensky has pushed for NATO to be as part of any kind of settlement with Russia. But now there's obviously talk of security forces or other types of troop deployments as a kind of security guarantee against Putin and Russia. In the aftermath of this, Oval Office meeting, Zelensky went away. He went to Europe. There was an emergency conference that was called where the UK, France, Germany, a number of other states came to basically support Zelensky and encourage him to re-engage with Trump. But they were making a similar argument that any sort of ceasefire agreement that happens has to come with some kind of guarantee of the United States as a backstop to that. So the significance of what has taken place is pretty momentous. We're living through, pretty important historical times. The press conference upended, in my view, a foreign policy that was pursued by the Biden administration and arguably represents a step back from successive US administrations since the Clinton era in the 1990s of pushing NATO and pushing NATO as a military alliance into Eastern Europe. For the time being, Trump is taking a back step from doing that. However, I'll go in, towards the end of this meeting that, this back step is not the end of imperialist tensions. Actually, it's much more a ratcheting up of imperialist tensions with China, which Trump sees as now a major rival to hold down. So I'm going to go into a little bit now about a discussion about the Ukraine war, because it has been a war that's been, very debated amongst the left, amongst the revolutionary left. So we have advocated for a very long time that the demands of an anti-war movement need to be centred around calling for the end of the invasion, Russian invasion into Ukraine, the end of the war, but also alongside that to also put demands to say that there should be no NATO involvement as part of any settlement. Now that second part of those demands has been, like I said, has been contested, and that's largely because there has been a very big debate about what is the character and nature of the war in Ukraine. If you look to Western governments, they have argued very consistently since Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine that this is about a war of human rights, a war of democracy, and they have justified Western involvement on that basis. There have been other sections of the left that have taken a slightly different approach. They've argued that the struggle in Ukraine is about self-determination, is about national liberation, something equivalent or akin to what we saw in Vietnam with the war against the the United States. Others have also argued that that's the character of the war is one of self-defense. For us, it's very important, and I think the evidence shows us what I'm going to argue, that the war in Ukraine actually represents a proxy war. It's a representation of inter-imperialist conflict, that is conflict between major imperialist powers. Just to give you just to emphasise what a proxy war is, some people may not know what that is. It involves there being the interventions by other imperialist powers, but it doesn't involve direct military confrontation. So proxy wars were very much a part of the kinds of conflicts that took place during the Cold War between the USSR and the United States. And what we're seeing today, arguably, is very much a proxy war in Ukraine between Russia and Western Europe, the imperialist states of the United States and Europe. So I'm just going to go through a little bit about why the character of this war is a proxy war. So there's a few things that really indicate this. So very early on in the war, as I mentioned, Zelensky basically drew in as much Western support as he could for the war. I mean, it's really quite, in the current context, also an amazing leap to think that the role, ambitions and motivations of the Western states, such as, the UK, France and America, are somehow not imperialist, that they're somehow about some lofty ideals about human rights and democracy, when what we've witnessed in Palestine is the way that the United States and the West has actually been manufacturing the armaments, the equipment, the military to actually allow Israel to see through a genocide on, historic times in our recent lifetimes. So the argument that, somehow this is, some sort of, human rights war is very far from the reality of what's taking place. If you look at also some of the statements of a number of generals who were part of the US military, when they describe the war in their own terms, they have also said that the war is actually, the objectives of the war are about actually trying to defeat Russia, land a blow against Russia, imperialism more generally, not actually about any immediate end to seeing peace or for self-determination on that front. There is also an important thing to recognise about, I guess, in terms of socialists, the support for self-determination and national liberation. There is, I think, a very good analogy that you can look to. It's an old one. I mean, I study history, so these ones I can think of, fairly easily. But in 1916, there was a rebellion by Irish people against British rule. It was known as the Easter Rebellion. And actually, Germany, this was during the First World War, Germany had supplied arms to the Irish fighters, as, obviously they had their own interests in doing so. Now, to say and, make some equivalent here that, that situation in Ireland is, perhaps what Zelensky's doing is very far from the truth. What the national liberation struggle in Ireland was doing, and, with the 1916 rebellion, was about saying Ireland should be free of British imperialism and not saying, and we want German imperialism to take its place. That's actually very different to what Zelensky is doing with the Ukraine. He's saying he's opposed to Russian imperialism, which we oppose unequivocally as well. The history of Russian imperialism in the region is a brutal one. I had some points, but I might run out of time. But Ukraine used to be part of the Russian Empire in the early 20th century. It gained its independence actually in the context of the Bolshevik Revolution for a period of time. That was obviously wound back with the rise of Stalin and the counter-revolution and towards the late 1920s. But what we're seeing, I guess the point is it's not an equivalence between seeing this as some sort of national liberation struggle. Zelensky has said explicitly that he wants Ukraine to play the role as something like Israel in the Middle East, to discipline, the way that Israel disciplines the other Arab states, for US and Western interests so they can maintain and dominate the region. Zelensky wants to play that role in the East, on the borderlands of all the states that neighbour Russia, that has been a fault line of global global imperialism for many years. I think the other thing that really confirms it, obviously, the billions and billions of dollars that have been given in support of of Zelensky. It's equivalent to the US, over the last few years. And the fact that even Trump went to negotiate and initiate discussions with Putin that didn't even involve Ukraine is another confirmation that what we have seen is a proxy war between major imperialist powers and in the region. And I think to understand this, I've got a little bit of time, so I will go into understanding why there is this competition by imperialist states in the sort of system that we live in. And basically, throughout the 20th century, obviously people are familiar with World War I, World War II. What we saw emerge and crystallise in this period, basically competition between capitals in a particular state or nation. That process that is inherent to capitalism basically spilled over national borders. The capital was fused with national states in this period. If you look between 1870 and the First World War, huge parts of the globe came under the boot of one or another European imperialist power. If you're talking about Africa, if you're talking about the Pacific, these were periods of time where they were very much firmly under direct imperialist control, and capitalist competition was very much the heart of that fusing of economic competition and geopolitical competition. And it's important to understand and pause a bit to understand what the geopolitical competition represents. It's not simply, okay, we want, to, like Trump is kind of doing now, just grab some minerals out of that particular colony or area of land to boost our profits and to boost our position. That's a big part of it, but there's also a big part of actually controlling territories to keep rivals out. So if you think about the Iraq War, actually, the war in Afghanistan, those wars were actually prosecuted by US imperialism, not so much to rip oil directly out of the US. I mean, Trump's very emphatic, we have enough oil in the United States. What they want to do is to be able to maintain a system where if other rivals want access to that oil or those minerals, they need to go through America. They rely on the goodwill of America to be able to get that, to get those minerals and raw materials for their production. And so basically, that period of inter-imperialist conflict, which underpinned the First World War, underpinned the Second World War, that changed dramatically after the Second World War, with the United States now as the, prime military and economic power in the world. It set up multilateral institutions across the world to dominate and ensure its hegemony. And it did that with a very, a philosophy of spreading a free market ideology and institutions to be able to acquire that position and that power. Alongside that, they also built up a huge amount of their military arsenal that went alongside of that. With the end of the Cold War, Russia was severely weakened as a result of that, with the fall of the Berlin Wall. But interestingly, if you look at the period, since the 1980s, Russia was actually able to reposition itself and regain some economic clout in world imperialism as a result actually of a lot of its energy deals. Partly this was to do with the disastrous failure with the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, which actually ratcheted up high energy prices because Russia actually exports a lot of gas and energy. It actually reaped a lot of benefit from that. It's also developed its own gas pipeline and energy deals with European states such as Germany. That development of its economic power relative to its previous position meant that Russia was looking, particularly with the election of Putin, to assert itself in the east, in its region. And this was happening at a time through the 1990s where, I mentioned earlier in my talk, Clinton and the US administration was using NATO as a way to push outwards against the east. And a number of the countries, sort of bordering Ukraine were considering actually joining NATO, forming, having a membership to NATO. And actually in Ukraine, in certain parts in the last 10 years, there was moves by particular certain Ukrainian leaders to try and actually make NATO membership part of its constitution. Again, another escalation of inter-imperialist conflict and dynamics in the region. So to sort of jump forward a bit to today in terms of what's happening, it is a good time to wrap up. So the ceasefire deal that, Trump has drafted up with the input of Putin at Zelensky's, initial request, we have to, be clear, it's not a deal that we welcome. This is a form of the US actually making Ukraine a vassal state so it can use it for its own imperialist ends. Why Trump wants to withdraw from the Ukraine in the short term is basically to focus on what he's doing, and we've seen with the tariff war against China to basically make sure and keep China out in terms of its as it has also risen as a rival player in world imperialism. Particularly, there's a number of markers to this about its shipping fleet, its manufacturing industrial base, which is now, it's actually bigger than Russia on a number of fronts as well. Yeah. Okay. So just maybe to finish up with a little bit. I mean, I can talk a little bit about the history of Ukraine's self-determination. We can talk about it in the discussion, but largely this demand for self-determination has been overwritten and subordinated to an inter-imperialist conflict between rival imperialisms. The question for us, as I said, we welcome the end of the war, but the ceasefire agreement is certainly not setting the terrain in terms for any kind of ending of inter-imperialist conflict in the near future. It's resetting them and ratcheting up inter-imperialist conflict to another part of the world in the Pacific, with China in the South China Sea. The social forces, to look at in terms of what can end war, we argued during the height of the Ukraine war, has to be the working classes, in Russia, in Ukraine, across the region, our own working class to actually demand an end to the war. Not looking to imperialist rivals, to try and address the war, because, the more that imperialist rivals are sucked in, the more the problems and the carnage is escalated and compounded. So I might leave it there. There's a lot to talk about.